Good afternoon, and welcome to the second in our three-part series on responding to COVID-19. My name is Jean Bell, and I direct the Advancing Practice program here at Nonprofit Quarterly. We're really glad you're here with us today. This second session is focusing on human resources. A week or so ago, we focused on philanthropy and had a great conversation about how COVID is challenging assumptions and practices there. And today we want to talk about human resources in nonprofit organizations and how we are balancing urgency and equity as we support staff in responding to COVID-19 and support our organizations as they respond to COVID-19. And we've got three great panelists. As we said in our outreach for this session, this is not a technical assistance webinar. It's not about the stimulus bills or the Leave Acts. It's really about how fellow HR practitioners who center equity in their work are supporting staff and thinking about experiments and the future of human resources in light of what we're learning in COVID-19. So we're really glad you're here for that conversation. We think it's not only an urgent one, to borrow that word, but a long-term important one as well. As you can see, we have a sponsor for today's webinar, NeighborWorks America, which I'm thrilled about. I've known about NeighborWorks, as I'm sure many of you have, my whole career in capacity building. And they have their Achieving Excellence program. The deadline, I think, for applying for this year is coming up in May. And it's a fantastic leadership program they do in partnership with Harvard Kennedy School. So please have a look at that. And thank you, NeighborWorks, for allowing us to bring this session to all of you free today. You'll also see our hashtag there, and we invite you to join us on social media. I've got three panelists here today, and again, purposely chosen because equity and justice are at the center of their organization's missions, but also their personal practices of HR and employment law. And so we're here today to have a conversation infused with that. And I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves now briefly. Tim, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Jean, thanks for the invitation to the party. Really excited to be here to hang out with everyone for the next hour. My name is Tim Sinova. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Fractured Atlas. Fractured Atlas is a national nonprofit arts organization, art service organization that helps artists, creatives, and makers of all stripes with the things they need to succeed as small businesses and entrepreneurs. At the organization, I'm also one of four co-CEOs. We have a four-person shared non-hierarchical leadership team. We also have a public commitment to be an anti-racist, anti-oppressive organization that is really infused into everything that we do. Aside from Fractured Atlas, I'm on the faculty at New York's New School and Canada's Banff Center for the Arts, where I teach people-centric organizational design. How do you craft workplaces where people can thrive? And then I sort of have a consulting company called Work Shouldn't Suck, because it shouldn't. That's at workshouldn'tsuck.co, and where for the past month, a colleague of mine have been live streaming daily conversations with leaders in the field about what's going on in their lives, sector, hopes for the future, and it's become sort of a time capsule, if you will, about what we're living, the time we're living in right now.
Thank you so much for being here, Tim. Joanne.
Yeah, thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Joanne Lee Wagner, and I'm the VP of People Operations at Common Future. We're headquartered here in Oakland, California. That's where I'm dialing in from today. At Common Future, our work is about building inclusive economies and really centering equity in all that we do. We do this by connecting wealth holders, such as foundation and investors, with community wealth builders, who are often nonprofit leaders, entrepreneur support organizers, and what we affectionately call the unofficial mayors of their town. So the people who really understand how to create change in their communities. Over the last 18 years, we've worked with over 200 community leaders across the US and Canada. And alongside them, we create economic power, choice, and ownership for those that are often the most marginalized by our systems. And because this is the focus of our work, we are really adamant about practicing what we preach and taking a proactive approach to HR. So we have a majority people of color staff, a majority female leadership team, and this absolutely influences the way we develop our policies and processes. So I'm excited to be here with you all today.
Thank you, Joanne. It's great to have you here. And Sejal?
Sure, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Sejal Thacker, and I'm the Chief Civility Officer of my own company, Train Extra. I have over, time flies, 15 years of employment law experience, and I've primarily practiced and represented management. What I found over the years is that I really have a passion for bringing more proactive and relevant workplace training to both employees, management, and leadership. Because what I found over the years was that lack of education was really the basis for why we're seeing all the complaints and the lawsuits that we do. So I have specialized in issues related to discrimination, harassment, and workplace bullying. And those are the types of cases that I really, really love to train on and bring awareness on in an interactive, engaging environment. I bring the courtroom to the classroom. And so 2 years ago, I started up Train Extra to provide a proactive approach to employers and provide my services.
Thanks. It's great to have you here, Sejal. Next slide, please. So as we've been doing with this COVID series, we're trying to have a conversation with really thoughtful practitioners. As you can see, we have 3 very thoughtful ones here with us today. And this is the arc of the conversation. And we invite you, as I said in the opening, to put your comments and thoughts in around each question. And we can fold them in. And also, we're trying our best to save some time at the end. But if you have questions, enter them, but you also may enter comments. So the conversation is going to go like this. First, I'm going to ask each of them to speak a little bit more to how their personal approach to running human resources, if you will, at their organizations was already changing and evolving because of their equity stance. My experience with COVID is that it's intersecting with whatever trends were already going on in fields and disciplines. And so we want to understand what journey were we already on to embrace equity in human resources, and then how does COVID intersect with that? And the second question will be, what specific HR steps have you taken to support staff during the pandemic? Then we'll hear a little bit more from Sejal about, well, if that's how we're doing this, what should we be cautious of with respect to employment law? And then this last question that we're excited about, and I think, Tim, you spoke to this in the purpose of the live streaming you're doing daily, is what are the experiments that may have been COVID-inspired, but will stay with us and may change faster or for the better how we approach supporting staff and developing human resources in our organization. So that's the arc of our conversation, so you know what's coming. Next slide, please. So let's start with that first question, and I'm going to start with you, Tim. I know that, as you mentioned in your introduction, Fractured Atlas already has an explicit anti-racism, anti-oppression stance, and I imagine that affects how you approach human resources. But just in a couple minutes, can you tell us how your approach, your practice of HR was already shifting to embrace equity at Fractured Atlas?
Yeah. Well, and Jean, I'm sorry, like right out of the start, I forgot to say where I'm from. And you're like, introduce where you're from. So at Fracture House, we have team members in 12 states, 6 countries, and I'm in New York City. I'm located in New York City. Got that. All right. I also, for the record, as we've talked about before, I really hate the term HR. It's like, for me, it connotes like the person who does payroll and benefits, and it sort of puts it off in the side corner. And that's why I really think about people-centered or organizational design. And as a core sort of leadership competency that we need to have, how do we create places where people can thrive? And over my career, as I was studying, quote unquote, great places to work, I was visiting places like Zappos and Zingerman's, and it was sort of all the places that kept coming up in these lists. I started to realize that some of the great places to work, and I'm not saying this specifically about Zappos and Zingerman's, but just like in general, some of the great places to work are pretty racist and oppressive. And how great is a place to work if it's racist and oppressive? And so, and then it started to go to, and actually maybe there are places that are great places to work that have commitments to anti-racism, anti-oppression, but resilience and self-care isn't there either. And so like if you're burning through the people that are committed to your missions and in your organization, like I really started to come together like this Venn diagram of 3 pieces. And from there, there's this phrase that we hear and say a lot, bring your whole self to work. And I started to realize that I'm having conversations with friends and colleagues and coworkers, very few people bring their whole selves to work. And actually with my HR hat on, it's like the people who usually bring their whole selves to work are the ones you have to have meetings about and meetings with. So like, can we just dial it down to like 85%? And then what I started to realize was there are some people who only feel comfortable bringing 25% of themselves to work, 30% of themselves to work, because they don't feel safe. There's not psychological safety. They don't trust the people they work with. And so as organizations, what can we do to maybe get everyone to 60%? How much richer of an experience would it be for people to work at places that are setting up structures and systems and an environment where people feel like they're comfortable with doing that? And so that's sort of everything that we do on our team and an organization. We sort of run that through the gauntlet. Through the gauntlet. Is it good for some people but not other people? How might we iterate and adjust and experiment with things? And I feel like that's the really exciting creative part about my job and the work that we get to do in people operations.
That's great. Thank you, Tim. Really helpful. Joanne, what would you build on? I know Common Future, as you said in your introduction, is a majority POC, a lot of women in leadership, obviously a very progressive mission. How was the way you approach HR already changing pre-COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I resonate so much with some of the things Tim has shared already. So for me, you know, one of my first experiences working in HR was as a disability coordinator at a very large nonprofit organization. And in that job, you know, as I was processing hundreds of thousands of leave claims, I really saw HR sometimes in its worst instances, right? A place where we were having a scarcity mindset, where people were really looking out for their own interests or trying to game the system in their favor. And employees in particular were seen as potential lawsuits and had to be handled and treated as such. And there was absolutely no deviating from the rules because that opened up way too much risk. And so as an HR leader here at Common Future, I really tried to take the opposite approach of that, you know, first experience and create a function that is really based on connection and trust. So, you know, similar to what Tim said, we work really hard to build a culture of psychological safety so that there is that continuous dialogue between employees and supervisors and management. And we find that trust really creates a foundation where we can then empower employees to self-manage and create a work life that fits into their real lives, right? About half of our employees worked remotely before shelter in place happened, and the other half worked remotely part of the time already anyway. And on top of that, we had flexible schedules that were pretty much the norm for us. You know, people really taking the time to do the personal things that they need to do, while also, of course, being held accountable to their work and the impact that they're making. I think for us, our organization, you know, equity is really about meeting the needs of our diverse staff so that they feel like the organization has their back. The policies that we are creating are about really acknowledging the difference of our staff members and not holding ourselves to that rigid one-size-fits-all standard. I would say we also invested in learning and development so that we could share a common language in how we talk about equity. It's so important to be on the same page about the concepts and what we mean and what we value, because it then provides that foundation from which we can continue to push the edge and learn and grow together. We often talk about equity as a journey, as almost akin to flossing, right? It's not something where you like, you know, you pull out the racism tooth or like the, that and then it goes away. It's something that you continuously work on. And so that's a big part of our culture in our organization. And finally, we have an equity team whose purpose is really to ensure that equity is infused in every nook and cranny of our organization. And so it includes things like annual training, an organizational equity audit, and really providing support to our colleagues across the organization in how to be more equitable in their projects and goals.
That's fantastic. So much in what both of you have said that we'll pick up on. Senjal, as an employment law attorney, how has your practice shifted, if at all, in response to your commitment to equity?
Sure. I mean, you know, I feel like I was doing the same thing before, and it just became so much more important on everybody's radar. That's really the difference, right? I mean, when I started my company, it was with the premise of how can I help companies develop their best practice in order to mitigate their legal risk, right? So, and my belief is that the focus should be on prevention. So waiting around until something rises to the fact of being legally actionable is going to be a problem for any organization. It doesn't work. That's why what we've been doing hasn't worked. And so my focus is to help employers mitigate harassment or discrimination, because take the focus off on just compliance or claim prevention and defense. Let's turn our attention and focus on what's really going to make this work, is to focus on cultures that are grounded in mutual respect. And so focusing on creating that kind of environment, I mean, especially now, right? I mean, we're seeing all kinds of racism and biases coming out. So I'm not saying that it wasn't important before. It was definitely important before, right? But so to me, I'm urging employers, look, be proactive as opposed to reactive, right? So call for that cultural change. And so you can't assume, and this is what a lot of employers do, and this is what frustrated me as a litigator, is that people assume that, okay, we've got the policies in place, we've got the procedures, and so, you know, nobody's speaking up, so we've got this great place to work. And that's not true. You can't assume that. You have to create a welcoming environment, you know, like what Tim and Joanne are saying. It's like where people feel safe to bring up these concerns, and not waiting, you know, again, the organization has to not be lip service, but to let everybody know and put the resources behind it that, look, we're going to create a designing system that even if it doesn't rise to the level of being actionable or legal harassment or discrimination, come talk to us about it. Because typically the progression to illegal behavior, it's not like it just happens overnight. There's a progression, right? You start seeing rude or microaggression kind of behaviors. And then, you know, sometimes people will put that person on notice, sometimes they won't. And the problem is that it continues. So it'll become unwelcome or dismissive behaviors, and then it'll become abusive conduct and bullying, and then we'll finally get to where it's discrimination or harassment. So what's important is to start putting people on notice when it's happening early in that progression, and then that person is responsible and accountable for their behavior. So again, getting everybody on board and empowering employees to create that culture is really what I feel is going to work.
Great, thank you. And there's a lot of connection between what you're saying and the kinds of cultures that Joanne and Tim are trying to create through their HR practices in their organizations. I'm going to try to launch a poll, and we're going to see how that works. So the poll question is, had your practice of HR in your organization already been changing pre-COVID to embrace equity? So now we can see the results, I believe.
Yeah. And
it looks like the vast majority of folks were already doing some degree of change before COVID hit. And so for some of you, it was quite a bit, about a third of folks, and about a half, it was sort of somewhat. And I think that's, from my understanding of, you know, all of our engagement with our readers at MPQ, that's pretty typical. It's a very small group that wasn't on some kind of journey, to use your language, Joanne. And then there's a group that's sort of out ahead that may have been born that way, sort of the organization was born an organization of equity and justice, or it's been on an active journey for some time now. And I think it's important as practitioners to think about where were we on that journey and what are we learning now that's going to fold into that. Great. Next slide, please. So now I want to shift, given that that's where your organizations were, Tim and Joanne, and get a sense of what are some of the steps you've taken, inspired by those values and that journey, to support staff during this pandemic. And Joanne, let me start with you. What have you done, building on what you just said, that's COVID specific to support people?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the smartest things that we did probably just pretty soon after all of these things were happening was send out a staff survey that was actually provided through the Management Center. And it helped us just more deeply understand the experiences of our employees. And what we really saw was that many of our employees were not only supporting their immediate families or impacted by childcare, but that they were also on the hook for supporting their extended families or even their families, right? The friends that are very close that they consider families, and that they were really the first in line to care for them if any of these folks were getting ill. In addition to that, our employees are very, very involved in their communities. Many are considered leaders in their communities and are volunteering on the front lines in addition to doing their day jobs. And so, we really recognize that it's a lot of responsibility and it's not easy. And our leadership team, really from the beginning, has set expectations that people should slow down and reprioritize work. At first, this looked like encouraging people to, cancel non-essential meetings. Right? We've always said, hey, we have too many meetings. And so now was the perfect time to really cancel those. We really wanted people to take space and process what was happening. Some folks even took working retreats, right? We had a couple leaders model this for their teams to do a week where they canceled all meetings, use that time to read or strategize or think about what was next, or even prepare, right? Or nap, right? Rest is so important too. I would say that we also have a lot of overperformers on our team. So I think maybe this is because we have a majority POC staff, and oftentimes with people of color, life teaches us that we need to be twice as good to be half as recognized. And so for us, it was really quite important to continue to emphasize the value of good enough, or that concept where instead of striving for perfection or 110%, really encouraging folks to focus on the work product that is good enough for now. Again, we want people to be able to create space and energy that they can then put towards processing the massive changes that are happening and really come out of that processing stronger, more balanced, more focused, right? We also saw that social isolation is a top concern for folks. So even as we're, have this message of hey, slow down, cancel all non-essential meetings, I think that, there's also this desire from staff to be more connected as well. And so we've enacted a lot of optional ways for people to connect, whether it's optional happy hours or even a fun Slack channel where people talk about what we've dubbed the quarantine cuisine, or the things that they're cooking in their kitchens or eating. We also have a Culture Buddies program that we had in place that we've continued, which pairs up people who don't necessarily always work together in the organization. There's a shared reading that folks do, and then they're encouraged to meet for 30 minutes to 45 minutes and do not necessarily a meeting per se, maybe a walking meeting, eat lunch together, something like that. Social isolation is so real during this time, and we definitely wanted to be mindful of that. Monetarily, we have implemented a $100 monthly stipend to cover utilities and cell phones. We also have an unlimited supply budget for staff, although we are kind of rethinking this because we're noticing that people aren't really using it. And so considering, maybe having a fixed reimbursable amount instead. And overall, what we've done is just try to normalize the abnormal. So by centering the experiences of those that we know are most impacted during this time, which is a core tenet of the way that we do equity in our work, by understanding that we are in a time of great uncertainty, and for the majority of people that causes a lot of anxiety, we've said, hey, reduced productivity is the new normal right now. And kids and pets as part of conference calls is the new normal. So don't stress about it. It's okay. And in the next phase of our response, we're really working to systematize this even further.
Those are super helpful examples. And I'm going to come back with a couple of questions for you. But Tim, let me see what you would build on. What additionally or differently have you done at Fractured Atlas in response to COVID?
Yeah, Joanne, coming out with a really strong list there. That's awesome. I'll go back to the transcript to get all that. So before COVID, Fractured Atlas was an entirely virtual organization before everyone else was. So I kind of think back to when I let my passport expire and had to get it expedited because I was traveling overseas, and the thing on the passport website said if you need your passport expired or expedited, you should do this before you need that expedited. I'm like, yes, that's great for next time, but that doesn't help me right now. And so there's this balance of like, some of these things we've had time to iterate, adjust, be intentional. Other things, it's like we need to iterate in the moment. So we have unlimited vacation days. We're entirely virtual. We provide staff with up to $100 as an internet reimbursement, because for us, high-speed internet is the one definite work condition that people need to have. If you don't have that, Zoom calls are really challenging. Accessing our files and stuff are really challenging. In sort of the past 6 weeks or so, I think the number of meetings that have started with "be kind to yourself," no one signed up for this. Just as a reminder, to Joanne, to your points, it's like where everyone is carrying such an overwhelming burden to just be a human being during this time, and to realize what's possible at work, what's really important, what has to get done, and then just let the other stuff go away. Some of our managers have instituted day off teams, 1 day off for teams. So everyone, since we have unlimited vacation days, it's really not I guess a ticker, but saying everyone's taking Monday off on this team. Because if only a couple people do, then some of the team members will be there, and then you'll get pinged. But if we all take Monday off, no one's going to be here, and the organization and everyone that depends on us will survive. And you need to take some time for yourself to be with your family. Some of our staff, as many on this webinar, are probably caring for kids, homeschooling kids, elder care. If we're not, we're worrying about our loved ones and friends that we can't be with around the country, around the world. So acknowledging the human toll that this takes, shortening Zoom meetings. There's like the Zoom meeting exhaustion coefficient that's like twice as it's like a two times multiplier for just in-person meetings. So if that meeting used to be an hour in person, can we do it in half an hour? Because by this point of the day, I'm on Eastern time by like 3:30. Like I can't go past half an hour. It's sort of diminishes. So like, let's shorten Zoom meetings. You can really find out what needed to be an email versus a meeting. Like just send an email and see if that works. Use Slack channels. I think, again, being explicit about kids and pets and interruptions from roommates and other people in Zoom calls. Just don't assume that people think, oh, no, that's fine, but be explicit. If your cat walks across the screen onto your keyboard, that's fine. Joanne, I was reminded of the SCARF acronym when you're talking, the things that flip fight or flight switches: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And certainty is a massive one for us right now. No one knows what the future holds. I barely know what tomorrow holds. And as human beings, as organizations, we're dealing with a vast amount of uncertainty. And also relatedness. Some of us used to be in an office with 50 people, and now we might be in our home or apartment alone without any outdoor space, any way to connect. And so I think recognizing the human toll, and just as leaders, as managers, just take your foot off the gas. Let's really, I think just in being explicit about that and talking with the team and opening up space in meetings for people if they want to talk about that. A colleague, Nina Simon, mentioned at her organization of By For All in Santa Cruz, they actually have gone the opposite direction with, instead of more gatherings, they're explicitly fewer gatherings. We have enough in our lives. Let's just do the meetings we need to, and recognize that a number of us are having like virtual cocktails with friends we haven't seen for years. And there's all these other things that we're doing. So let's say we're going to do less. And when we're ready, we'll start to add in the book club again, or the craft club. And so I think part of that is just, one, it's recognizing and being explicit about the toll this is taking us as human beings. And two, being explicit about the things some of us might think everyone knows, but especially as we're distributed, information flows in different ways. And so making sure that everyone knows what's expected and what's possible.
Thank you, Tim. And a number of people have asked about the acronym, and we don't have time to go into it deeply, but can you reiterate the SCARF acronym, please?
SCARF, these are the things that flip fight or flight switches: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness.
Right. And so we can all Google that. Many people are interested in it, but it resonates just on the face of it. And this idea that people are having different reactions to the operating context each day. I know in my own work, some people come into spaces like, wow, this is an opportunity for transformation. We're going to get policy wins. We're going to change our HR practices. And other people come in with 3,000 people died yesterday, and they're both true, right? And trying to navigate that in the moment and across multiple people. And what I hear you both saying is that leaders really have to model creating that safety and that spaciousness for the variety of experiences on any given day that people are having. On the next slide, Sejal, just briefly, I want to, as you listen to the kinds of responses that people are employing, they have to do with letting people set their own schedules. Of course, both of these organizations, to some extent, were doing that before COVID. So, but working from home, some of these issues, what comes up for you with your employment law hat on? What do we need to just be mindful of?
Sure. Look, my whole mission right now is to work with employers, and what I've been doing is what the Department of Labor has said, right, is collaborate with employees, include them in these conversations, right? Be flexible, look for how can we meet each other's mutual needs, and make arrangements, voluntary arrangements, telework, intermittent leave, whatever you need to do to maintain that relationship. And so I've really been working with employers and saying accommodate needs when you can. Right? There may not be situations where you always can, but if somebody needs some paid sick time or paid time off, or they need an intermittent leave opportunity, to work from home because they have their child at home and there are certain hours of the day they got to do homeschooling, I'm saying be flexible, whether it's paid or unpaid. That's a business decision, but really allowing time off for employees to take care of their own needs, including, by the way, taking care of their mental health. I mean, a lot of people are used to sitting at a computer in an office, and now you're at home, you're in a completely different environment. You don't have that social interaction. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of unknowns. All of these things are going to increase stress, which can lead to legal, workers' compensation claims, disabilities, reasonable accommodation requests. So there's a lot of legal risk on that side if you don't maintain and manage these kinds of issues. So I've been telling employers to allow for flexibility, look at reasonable accommodation requests with a little bit more of an open mind approach than you might have done in the past, and be more interactive. And the communication is so important right now. And so one of the main areas that I've been touching on with employers is the role of managers, and really educating managers and doing a lot of consulting with leadership on how important it is to get middle management involved in this picture, rather than saying, what might have been the approach before, where send everybody to HR or send everybody to that disability person so they'll handle it. I don't think organizations can afford to do that right now. I think managers have to have the training and know what to say, how quickly to act, where to go, what the complaint process is. It's a great time to review policies with managers, your complaint process. And because we're going to see issues come up right now that maybe weren't coming up before. You're going to see more disability complaints. You're going to see national origin, discrimination on a number of different other protected categories right now because of what we're going through. And managers may not know how to react to those situations. So there may be areas that, and I've been, I wrote down here because I wanted to mention this, I've been telling some of my clients, maybe you want to consider creating a COVID-19 policy resource for your organization, where it's a specific addendum or something, and it's going to be tailored to your organization, but to your employee handbook, dealing with some of these policies and what to do in these kind of crisis situations. What happens if somebody reports illness due to COVID? That's something we haven't been talking about, right? And then also making sure they know where to report these complaints, because maybe before they were going, so I've been telling my clients, maybe you want to designate a specific individual that's going to be handling these COVID-19 related complaints, that knows how to handle these, which got to be handled differently than maybe some of these other ones. And then who's going to be investigating these complaints, right? So there's a lot of things that employers need to do. And by the way, the harassment, discrimination complaints and diversity and inclusion training, these things tend to get put on the back burner at times like this, we're trying to put out all the fires, but it's more important than ever to continue educating people on these issues, because I'm seeing a lot of cyberbullying cases right now. People are working remotely and microaggressions coming out. So unconscious biases are coming up, and you're dealing with somebody whose computer isn't turning on. And now you're thinking, oh, God, I don't want to put this person on a project because they're going to derail the whole thing because their computer doesn't work. So there's different kinds of issues coming up. These were there before, but now they're just different. And so we have to address them and be proactive about it. Communication is critical. Communication is so important. And so making sure your messages that you're sending to your staff, and making sure that it's not sending off the wrong type of message, right? So,
so many people have reminded me that this tension between urgency and equity is around speed as well. And in our last webinar about philanthropy, Sam Cobbs, who runs Tipping Point, said it's called comfort food for a reason. We revert back to what's comfortable. And sometimes in human resources, what's comfortable is a pretty extreme sort of risk management frame instead of the individualization that you're saying we might need to do. And I love the idea not only of making sure that middle managers feel prepared in a way that they might feel really stuck right now. Supervisors, do they feel prepared to respond to their supervisees? Maybe they're not on the executive leadership team, but they're that interface. And secondly, the idea of an addendum to your HR policies that explains some of the COVID-specific responses that the organization is employing. Let me go to the next slide, thank you, and start to talk about the kinds of experiments or enhancements of existing policy that have happened in COVID that you think might change us for the better or stay with us. And Joanne, I want to kind of start with you. Again, purposefully, you're both organizations that have done a lot of work on this journey to help inspire us, but what do you think may continue to change because of what you're learning now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this pandemic is highlighting really the inadequacies of the systems that we rely on. Because of our broken philanthropic systems, many nonprofits are in positions where they have less than 1 month of working capital reserves, if at all. Our Black and Brown communities continue to be disproportionately affected, as they always are in disasters. And not only are we as a community, as a world, kind of seeing these happen in real time, but many of us are now really experiencing the things that are really commonplace for the most marginalized in our communities. So experiences like, racism, like Sejal was talking about, and bullying, xenophobia, I would say, is such a big thing right now, the lack of access to healthcare, food scarcity, lack of childcare, that overwhelming sense of uncertainty. And I think that right now, HR professionals are really, able to see, different paths in front of them. So one being kind of like looking for COVID things to end, we return back to the status quo, and one, or perhaps, one that is really truly more supportive of our employees. Right now in our organization, Our Common Future, we've been really thinking about a reimagine and restructure framework with our work. And so I think for us as HR professionals, that's also so true around how can we reimagine and restructure our policies, our practices that are more aligned to our mission and values at this time, now more than ever. Specifically, I think a couple of the things that we're doing that we can lean more into, right? So for us as a sector, really thinking about rapid experimentation, iteration, and responsiveness. I know a couple of my fellow panelists have talked about that. But these are really proven key tools that help us to do work in uncertain and volatile climates like the one we find ourselves in now. I also really feel like flexible schedules, remote work, and some type of paid sick leave, I don't really see that going away. With the appropriate structures in place that ease communication challenges, systems that ensure accountability, like good old-fashioned individual goal setting and one-on-one check-ins, right? Like these things are very easily doable and provide that much-needed flexibility as this interruption in our lives lingers on. In terms of staff benefits, so before COVID happened, we were looking at a tuition reimbursement plan for our staff. And now with COVID, we're actually challenging ourselves to take a broader approach to that benefit and really think about how we might be able to convert the funds to be more supportive of a variety of needs of our employees. So whether that's going to be tuition reimbursement, yes, and also perhaps could the funds for those that aren't interested in pursuing continued education, be a paid leave or sabbatical support or supporting dependent care. And so our goal there is really to continue to create something with enough flexibility and capital in order to acknowledge the diversity of our employees' needs, really meet them where they are. And that's really what HR and equity in HR looks like for us.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Tim, what would you build on? What are you seeing that might stay with us?
Yeah, all terrific stuff from panelists. People are forming new habits, and how they live and how they work, what they expect from work, what they expect from life. Some people are reflecting on a life that they had for years that maybe isn't the life that they want. And I mean, I hope this pandemic changes the way we work, because work wasn't working for most people. The quote unquote normal that many people talk about returning to is actually what got us here. So let's figure out a way to create together a future that works for everyone and that we actually want. And when it comes to a workplace, this is where I think my version to the term HR. When you say HR, it lives with one person or a team. When you talk about people-centric organizational design, it starts to live in the DNA of the organization. People talk about it. People offer suggestions. Maybe we could try this. Maybe we can do that. Have we thought about this? And it becomes much more vibrant and responsive to what organizations are able to do. In 2 months, we have proven that people can work if no one's watching them, and that things that were, quote unquote, impossible or too expensive are actually possible. And our colleagues in the disability justice community have been saying this for years, and to amplify and to learn from what they've been talking about. This is where we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Is what I'm saying, and this is going to be with us for a while. I mean, if you think about this from an OSHA standpoint, and it's like no one likes to think about OSHA, or usually thinks about OSHA. It requires workplaces to be free of hazard, and usually you think about frayed wires or sharp edges. But when you think about COVID-19 as a hazard, and if you can't provide a physical workplace that's free of that, without a vaccine, without testing, all of these things that we're talking about, that's going to be problematic. And so I like to meditate on the question, what do we want our workplaces and our lives to look like and feel like in, say, 5 years? And I recognize in saying 5 years, I usually say 5 years, but next Monday feels like a year from now. But far enough in the future that it's close, but not too close. And then say, how can we create things in our organization? How can we take slices of the organization? Let's look at, how do we support people? Let's look at how we have conversations. Are they healthy conversations? Or are they toxic conversations? Let's look at transparency and alignment. Does everyone know what's going on in the organization? Let's look at performance management and growth, or resilience and self-care, recognition, whatever it might be. Because when you talk about organizational culture, it feels like this monolith that it usually feels like someone has just tossed you a flaming Gordian knot, and you're like, I don't know what to do with this or where to start. And so I love that, Joanne and Sejal, you've been breaking down slices. Just start working someplace, identify something, and then work with your coworkers to figure out what that should look like.
And I really want to build on. Yes. Okay. Picking theme back up. I want to emphasize the list that you just listed, Tim, because as you can imagine, and I totally understand it, our comments are running 3/4. Oh my God, that's all amazing. How do you do an equity audit? How do you, to 1/4? We can't afford that. Our funding doesn't allow that. Our state doesn't allow that with, non-exempt employees, et cetera, et cetera. And those things are real, right? And I know in my own experience of, quote, human resources, there's this constant tension between designing our human resources system to the most restrictive element of law versus the whole list you just gave him, none of which had anything to do with law. Toxic conversations, transparency and alignment, self-care, all of these things are options that may be getting lifted up or seem obviously necessary in COVID, but actually were obviously necessary pre-COVID and will be afterwards. So I just want to encourage that a lot of the things that have been said on this webinar are well within the means of even direct service or human service or heavily regulated nonprofits. It's just a different definition of what human resources is really for. Joanne, I wanted to see if you had any kind of comment on that. If you were speaking to those who feel a little more restricted in their definition of HR or the compliance framework, where might they start or begin with this work?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that you, again, not all of us are going to be able to go out the gate and do, the unlimited PTO or, right, the fully paid leave for 12 weeks for all of our employees. And so it is really just about understanding deeply the experiences of your employees and starting where you can, wherever that is, whether that's just even introducing a check-in question in your next one-on-one to see how your employees are doing, right? Something as simple as that can show that an employer cares, right? That they're here to support you, that they recognize you as a person outside of just, the person doing the job, and can go such a long way. And that doesn't cost any money, just a little bit of time, and sets you on the path.
Yeah, thank you for that. There are a lot of questions about your equity team and your equity audit. Can you say, and I know those predate COVID, so which is great. That's what we're talking about here. Can you just say briefly, what is the charge of your equity team? And an example of how they might engage or hold accountable another aspect of the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So for our equity team, in our organization at large, we have a goal setting process where each of our projects have goals. We use the SMARTY framework, which is, again, a tool from the Management Center that has inclusion and equity as a part of that goal writing. So what our equity team does is takes a look at those goals once they're written. We also can help support team members in the writing of those goals to ensure that equity is a part of that, and just kind of provides a bit of accountability to ensure that our team is in fact, right, including that IE in the SMART goals. With regards to the audit, the one that we use is from the Coalition of Communities of Color. And I can provide a link to that via my Twitter if folks want to reach out to me there.
Great, and all of their Twitter handles are on the screens here. That's super helpful. We only have about a minute and a half for this answer schedule, I'm sorry, but can you just list up an idea or two? People are talking about a little bit of what Tim was saying about the people who bring 100% can sometimes be challenging. I know you were sort of kidding, but what about the folks who are performance problems, and now we're moving into the space of higher trust, greater flexibility? How do we reconcile that in HR where we still have to hold people accountable, even if we're excited and pleased to push our boundaries in other ways?
No, that's a great question. And, I mean, that's been one that I've been talking about since this has happened, because on one hand, it's like you have to still manage your employees and they still have to perform their work. And then on the other hand, we're just going through a lot and you just don't know what the challenges people are going through. And then you add on top of that, people are going to have questions. This is all new for a lot of people. So when I hear people say, we're going to go back to the new normal, I'm like, what is that going to look like? People are still going to have questions when they come back, right? Reentry is going to create new challenges. How people are going to, do they feel comfortable being back in the office? How are we going to build the morale, right? Because you're going to assume that some people are going to want to stay at home and work. So I think that the managers have to be they have to clearly understand their role. And that's understanding that they speak as agents of the organization. And so being prompt and timely and answering questions immediately. And then if they don't know where to go, knowing where to go to get that answer becomes super critical, because their heightened sensitivity. And so they're going to be looking at things through this lens. And what I see supervisors doing is putting their hands up saying, I'm not going to manage. Because they're afraid that if they say something wrong or they do something, that it might lead to some kind of retaliation complaint. And that was a real fear before COVID-19. I mean, retaliation complaints are 51% of all the complaints that are reported across the nation. So employers were already starting to do that. So now it's even more pressure on them. But they got to keep managing and really get help. And this is where HR becomes critical. And I think we really have to encourage everybody that problem-solving approach, what you can to try to be flexible to solve the problem, instead of that, here's what we're going to do about it. You can't have that. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and you have to look at each one case by case. Yeah.
I'm so taking from you the need to support managers, people who supervise people. And sometimes when we're talking about this more collaborative approach, we lose sight of that key relationship, is that, people who supervise people have to be supported and informed. Tim, can I close with you? You said that Fractured Atlas was already virtual because you serve organizations in, I think, across the country and maybe even the world, and have staff in many states. What can you say about supervising people virtually? What tips do you have? We'll have a number of questions about if this is going to stay this way, or even some people we've realized really don't need to be in the office, frankly, to get their work done. Maybe that's what we learned through COVID, and they would like to be home, and it would change the quality of their life to be home more. How do you supervise virtually?
We have a piece on the Fractured Atlas blog where a couple of our managers actually wrote about this, because they all approached it differently. I think going back to one of the first things Joanne said is the built around trust. And you start building that, that takes a long time to build, and it's easy to lose, but trusting that people are able to get the right work done, having the framework, whether it's SMART goals, SMARTY goals, objectives and key results, some way that you can have these conversations so that people know what's expected of them. And some of our managers do daily stand-ups on Zoom. Others do daily stand-ups, quote unquote, on Slack. So everyone posts what you're working on for the day. And then at the end of the week, they do weekly wins so that you're not adding yet another thing. It's like one more meeting, it just feels like it's going to crush you. So being flexible, learning what things work for different members of your team. People's schedules might change if they're now homeschooling their kids and taking care of their parents. They might have different windows than they used to. So slide meetings around, be understanding about that. But I think it goes back to trusted conversations and through that transparency. And to Sejal's point, then holding people accountable in an empathetic and human way. I was reading a study recently about the things to do at work, and I thought, someone's going to put out a study that's like, the way to create great workplace is just be an empathetic human, because it seems like everything boils down to just be a human being and understand that you work with other human beings and be flexible and iterate. And sometimes you're going to get it right. Sometimes you're getting it wrong. Sometimes things will last for a few months and then you have to iterate again. And I think that's one of the things that came out of that article from people that I work with and just my own experience managing virtual teams. Just try different things. And fellow panelists, just try something, see what it works, see if it works. Don't feel like you need to have it right straight out of the starting gate, or I don't even know what a starting gate is. So straight out, whatever starting gate is, I've heard that phrase before. Yes, immediately.
Yeah, and I think that's a through line. Both of you started with this, and again, I want to acknowledge the they're numerically a minority, but I know it's a really important voice, which is, well, wait a second, we're losing funding. We're in direct service, right? And I just want to keep positing back, because I've been an executive director, and I remember, long ago hearing ideas like this and thinking, oh, that's way too radical for us. We can't do. I really encourage people to focus on the creativity that Joanne and Tim are talking about, and the expansion of the definition of HR. Every single context has an appropriate version of that. It may not be the same as Fractured Atlas or Common Future, but as Joanne said, we can start with check-ins and meetings. We can start with surveying our staff. We can start with creating a team that looks at equity across the organization. All of those things are things, among many ideas we heard today, that we can do in any kind of mission or business model. So I really appreciate that connection to the longer journey of centering equity in and through COVID. So if we can turn to the last slide, I want to thank everybody so much for joining us. Your comments and questions were inspiring to us, and they will certainly inform what we write about and future webinars. So thank you for taking the time to write them in. Thank you, Tim, Joanne, and Sejal for your work and your numerous great ideas for us today. And thank you, NeighborWorks, for being a sponsor and allowing us to bring this to all of you for free. Check out their Achieving Excellence program, which is coming up this year. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.